Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the second part of the Mexico Institute's 10th Annual U.S.-Mexico Security Conference. My name is Andrew Redman. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute here at the Wilson Center. As is well known to this audience, the challenges presented to the U.S. and Mexican governments by the trafficking of drugs, weapons, money, and people cannot be addressed unilaterally. Our annual conference is in fact predicated on the firm conviction that only by recognizing the mutual shared threat posed to citizens on both sides of the border by these crimes and developing collaborative strategies can our governments hope to create safer societies for all of us. In keeping with that spirit of collaboration, this year's conference began with presentations from representatives from the US and Mexican governments. Assistant Secretary Robinson and Councilor Burkett provided their government's perspectives on the recently agreed bicentennial framework for security, public health, and safe communities, and shared plans to address the issues facing both countries. In fact, a bilateral meeting to approve the action plan under the framework was held yesterday in Mexico. Our session last week on the framework was followed by a discussion on the role of the Mexican military and the expansion of its duties and responsibilities. Both of these sessions are available for viewing on the Wilson Center webpage. This afternoon, we'll continue to explore some of the challenges facing Mexico and the bilateral security relationship. Our first panel will focus on femicide and crime prevention. Panel 2 this afternoon features state government and federal legislative representatives who will share their perspectives on the security challenges and possible solutions. And our final panel will address AMLO's security strategy. To start off this afternoon, I'm delighted to introduce the moderator for our first panel, a longtime colleague and friend of the Mexico Institute, Alexandra Zapata Ojeda. Alexandra is a researcher and activist whose work is focused on education policy and the development of tools to increase citizen participation around issues of accountability and anti-corruption. The platforms mejoratuescuela.org and 3de3.mx have engaged millions of users with data to demand tangible improvements in public service delivery. She's been Deputy Director and Civic Innovation Director at the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness. She sits on the advisory boards of the World Economic Forum Risk Report, the Mexican Foundation for Health, known as FunSalud, Enseña por Mexico, and Mejor Mexico, among others. She's also a regular media contributor for national and international press. And most recently, she was associate producer and impact director of the film A Cop Movie, a call to reflect on Mexico's current security and impunity crisis. In addition, Alexandra recently sat for an interview with our colleague Samantha Kane about femicide in Mexico as part of our Beyond the 16 Days of Activism program, and that interview is available on our website. Alejandra, thanks so much for being with us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I feel an enormous privilege to be presenting this panel. I can't wait to hear what the three of them have to say, and I'm sure it will be a very enriching conversation. So I will start off by presenting our three panelists in the order that they will be presenting their work. I'll start off with Dr. David Shirk. Thank you so much for being here with us. Dr. Shirk is a professor and graduate director in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of San Diego and a global fellow at the Mexico Institute. He directs Justice in Mexico, a policy research initiative on criminal justice and the rule of law in Mexico, and conducts research on Mexican politics, US-Mexican relations, and law enforcement and security along the US-Mexican border. From 2003 to 2013, he was director of the Transborder Institute at the University of San Diego. And before that, he was a fellow at the Center for US-Mexican Studies. Thank you so much, David, for being here with us today. Dr. Maria Teresa Martinez Trujillo is a professor and researcher at the Tecnológico de Monterrey, where she serves as a Latin America analyst with a particular focus on Mexico. She's currently undertaking research with the Mexican think tank Mexico Evalúa on violence against women and girls, and we'll talk more about that throughout this conversation. Her research focuses on businessmen and protection mechanisms, government and non-government policing practices, and violent configurations and corruption. In addition to her research, she has done field work across several cities in Mexico and has collaborated as a consultant on a multitude of research projects with civil society organizations and firms within Mexico. I had the privilege of working with her on a specific project just a couple of months ago, and it was a pleasure. And last but not least, Dr. Gemma Lopez is a historian and sociologist who specializes on questions of violence, crime, religion, and gender in the 20th and 21st century Latin America, with a particular focus on Mexico and Central America. She's a global fellow with the Mexico Institute. She's also a Marie Curie Junior Fellow at the Freiburg Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of Freiburg, and an assistant professor of Latin American history at Loyola University in Chicago. Prior to joining Loyola, she was assistant professor of international relations at the ITAM, Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México in Mexico City, and a visiting fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Thank you, Gemma, so much for being here. And with that, we can start off this panel, and I'll hand it over to you, David. Thank you so much. We can't wait to hear about your work.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Andrew and the Mexico Institute. It's such a pleasure to be here again. I've been, I think, at each of the security forums over the last decade, and I'm sorry that we have to keep doing the security forum and talking about the things that we have been dealing with, but it's, I think, very important and has always helped to move the discussion and the dialogue forward. I'm going to quickly share my screen here. And so I'm going to present some research for a working paper that we are putting out this month on the role of special prosecutors in combating violence against women. We all know that one of the key elements and objectives of the bicentennial framework is to improve prosecutorial capacity in Mexico. And this is an area of particular interest. And so I want to also mention my co-authors, Tegan McGinnis and Octavio Rodriguez. Tegan is a graduate of our bachelor's in international relations and is currently enrolled in our master's in international relations. And this work really grows out of her undergraduate thesis, where she started asking some questions about femicide, and we continued working on those to put together this working paper. And also we had the help and support of our resident lawyer / data scientist, Octavio Rodriguez, to work out some of the numbers in the mapping. And it starts really with a puzzle, because we've heard a lot about the increased incidence of violence against women in Mexico over the last year or two. Justifiably, people are outraged over the terrible incidents of violence with the brutal murder of Ingrid Escamilla, the disappearance and murder of Fatima Celia Adrigueti back in early 2020. And we started to hear about the problem of rising violence against women in Mexico. But there's a little bit of a paradox here, right? Because in a sense, violence against women has remained fairly constant. The share of homicides, for example, targeting women in Mexico has not increased. It's basically stayed at about the same proportion. 1 in 10 homicides in Mexico targets a woman. And that's been true since as long as we have data from INEGI. But that said, female homicides or homicides targeting women are different. And they're different in part because of the modus operandi of many of these homicides. You can see that a much greater share of homicides targeting women involve otro elemento. They involve some blunt instrument or some method of killing, strangulation perhaps, which implies a different kind of violence, and often intimate partner violence, domestic violence, or sexual violence. And so there's a clear need to think about and investigate the problem of femicide distinctly from the way we look at other kinds of crime. And a number of researchers have done really important work to emphasize the nature of femicide as the having distinct modes of killing and particular characteristics that target women because of their identity as a woman. And there's been a big push in Mexico really since the mid 2010s to specially codify homicides targeting women as a specific criminal offense with very specific modalities. And this is true not only in Mexico, but in other parts of Latin America. And what we've seen then is that as we've seen the increase in violence throughout Mexico, and along with that, rising levels of homicide against everyone, including women, the proportion remains the same, but the numbers have gone way up. We've also seen a dramatic increase in the number of femicide prosecutions. In fact, the rate of femicide or female homicides increased by about 66% from 2015 to 2020. But the number or the rate of femicide investigations was double that. And that's, I think, very important because it's suggestive that something's happening with femicide investigations that involves prosecutors, right? Prosecutors are the ones who decide what kinds of cases need to be classified as a femicide and investigated as such. And so when we look actually at female homicides, the slide I showed you earlier with female homicides, and compare the nature of female homicides to the nature of femicide investigations, we see that those kinds of investigations are in fact much more focused on those particular kinds of cases that involve the otro elemento, right? The other element, where in many cases, these are very brutal, violent killings and done in a way that doesn't involve firearms as much, doesn't involve some of the other things. They do involve more frequently an arma blanca, a knife or an edged weapon. We also see that femicides are a little bit, there's some geographic variation in where we see more femicide investigations in Mexico. And this is important because, you would expect femicides to be sort of equally distributed, but they're not. And part of that, we think, has to do with the distribution of prosecutorial capabilities. So we asked the research as our basic research question, in terms of budgets or other prosecutorial capacity, what is the role of prosecutors in investigating the femicide investigations? How does that have an effect on the number of femicide investigations that we see in different Mexican states? Now we had to go out and gather budgetary data on Attorney General's office, which was not very easy to do, but we were able to identify for 2019 the budgets for all state attorneys general, and we found huge differences controlling for population in the amount of money and resources that come to bear in different states. So there's variation on this independent variable, if you will. We also, though, saw that there were different legal reforms and different prosecutorial mechanisms that were established in different states. Some states have a designated office of a special prosecutor, like Nuevo León, which has a special femicide prosecutor investigator, Griselda Nunez, who was sworn in here in 2018. Other states, like Baja California, for example, where they have maybe a sub office that is dedicated to homicide investigations or even female homicide investigations, but it doesn't have its own sort of independent or autonomous office within the AG. And so we didn't count those as cases where the mechanisms and resources were as robust. So we went out and gathered a bunch of data on this, and we talked to Mexican government officials, experts, some of the special prosecutors to try to get a handle on what's going on. And I won't bore you with the methodology, but we did a couple of statistical tests to try to see what the differences were between states that have special prosecutors for femicides and violence against women and those that do not. And we also looked at as I said, the budgetary question. So when we looked at state budgets, there's a slight trend here, but it's not statistically significant. In other words, we can't discount the possibility that this trend, which is still fairly mild, is not just the result of random coincidence. So it's not necessarily that state budgets are influencing the number of femicide investigations. But our second hypothesis, the effect of a special prosecutor, yielded really interesting and robust results. We found in states that had a special prosecutor, there was a 60% increase in the number of femicide investigations, and that difference was statistically significant. But we talked to some prosecutors in certain states that didn't have a special prosecutor's office. They said, well, those other states that have a special prosecutor, they're more violent than our states. So that's why they have more femicide prosecutions. Luckily, we could test that proposition by controlling for the homicide rate. And we still found a 50% increase. We had to log the homicide rates because there's such a huge variance in distributions there. But we found even in states that had higher rates of homicide, or even logging, controlling for homicide rate, there were 50% more femicide investigations in states with a special prosecutor. So this is important. And it brings me to my sort of final slide here, because our findings suggest that, yes, first of all, femicides are important and something we need to pay attention to because they are a special kind of crime, a particularly heinous kind of crime that does require specific investigative and prosecutorial approaches. We also, as an obvious finding here, would suggest that many states that have not dedicated specific prosecutorial resources and units or even laws that strengthen those units need to consider doing so if we want to properly identify and target these kinds of femicides, these kinds of brutal crimes, as society, Mexican society, and the international community is calling for. All states should really consider providing specialized training and other resources to support those investigations. And for our purposes as policymakers and analysts, we really need to get more and better data. We couldn't get data, for example, for 2019 on the exact budgets of these different special prosecutors' offices, but we suspect that would probably enable us to look even more closely at what's going on with these kinds of investigations. And we also could use better identification of prosecutorial offices. It took a lot of digging on our part. We're going to do some future research looking at prosecutorial autonomy as a possible factor here. But with that, I'm going to stop and thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, David. And in keeping with the schedule, I'll hand this conversation straight over to Tere. Thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing questions from the audience and from this panel as well.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you to the Mexico Institute for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here for the first time and to share the table with colleagues that I really admire. So it's a big pleasure. I'm going to present part of a project that we have been conducting in Mexico Evalúa in alliance with the UN Spotlight Initiative. So I'm going to speak for a team of women that have been working in this project for a lot of months now. And of course, it's a big project, so I am going to try to choose some results and some of the main ideas. And I am going to read some of my notes in order to respect the time. So in Mexico, the monthly figures showing how femicides, sexual abuse, or domestic violence keep rising. That's something that we all know. Despite their value, the figures we know let a lot of information in a blind point. For instance, what do we know about violence survivors? What is the path that a woman walks to get the attention of the state while being victim of violence? To what extent this attention is effective not only to repair the damage, but mostly to avoid the violence to scale? In order to answer this and many other questions, it is necessary to have much more statistical information. That's a point that with the one David finished his own presentation. We need more and better data. Data of which quality is an essential attribute. And by quality, we are meaning information that it's reliable, standardized, comparable, disaggregated, robust, systematic, and accessible to the users. We build on the idea that the quality of statistical information shapes the quality of public action. That, of course, could be true for any other public problem. Then what makes gender-based violence different? Why do we have to take time to inquire on data quality regarding this subject? There are 4 attributes on violence against women and girls to keep in mind. First, gender-based violence is repetitive and accumulative behavior. That tends to scale in time, forcing women to climb up a pyramid from the quotidian violence acts to the femicides at the top. So any state intervention must seek to break this repetitive pattern. Otherwise, the state furthers this institutional violence. In addition, along her life, a woman faces different types of violence, some of them at the same time, others well related with their age. A proper treatment of this kind of violence supposes not only manage the current violent episode, but a pattern that likely comes from a long time ago and could keep going in the future. Third, when it comes to women, the bias on the poor quality of information product is not random. As scholars have shown, it is the result of historical inequalities between men and women. In this project, we also prove that they are the source of deeper inequalities. Fourth, once a woman knocks any door of the state, her path is not linear. It means that she does not go from one desk to another in a well-traced route. By contrast, she could go from one agency to another, or her case could be in many different desks at the same time. By the way, every desk is a potential source of information about every case. That implies a big challenge for the state and shows the importance of recording every interaction between women, victims of violence, and authorities. Thus, the main question is, how do local public agencies in Mexico produce statistical information on violence against women and girls? What could we do to improve the information's quality and consequently public policies? To answer these questions, we conduct a multi-method study in 5 municipalities in Mexico: Chihuahua and Ciudad Juárez at the north of the country, Ecatepec and Naucalpan in the state of Mexico, the center of the country, and at the south, Chilpancingo in Guerrero. All of them register high levels of femicides, sexual abuse, missing people, and they have gender alerts. We conducted 43 semi-structured interviews and 6 working groups with public servants. We analyzed hundreds and hundreds of administrative records, databases, and also official documents. As you can imagine, we collect an unmanageable amount of information. So considering the time constraints, I'll just mention 3 key problems we verify on the ground that say enough about data quality, but also give us some ideas of how to improve them. Number 1, an administrative record is not statistical information. Most of the public servants or offices in charge of producing statistical information are not aware of its importance or usefulness. What they are doing every day is to keep administrative records. If they register something related with violence victims, that is in order to account their quotidian activities, sometimes to justify budget exercise, others to prove they must not disappear. That explains a multiplicity of formats to collect the information, from a piece of paper to Excel sheets, but also that no one is paying attention on what to measure and how to do it. Then Conceptual discordances between different agencies is common, and David was also clear enough about the idea of the importance of considering how difficult it is to conceptualize femicide. Well, that happens in the long scale of violence, in all kinds of violence. In consequence, the definition and operationalization of variables are not uniform, even comparable between some registers and others. Again, one thing is to prove you are working serving victims, and another thing is to collect information to analyze patterns and to better understand gender-based violence and how to prevent it. In this category also stands out the lacking of specialized teams to collect, process, and analyze data. Most of the time, the same public servants that are paying attention on victims are those ones collecting information. On the one hand, it is possible that social workers, psychologists, or medical doctors are able to obtain much more information than any other profile, since they could create a bond of trust with victims. However, in an overcharged scenario, between paying attention to the victims and writing down some information, they will likely choose the first one. And in the short term, we hope they do. But in the long term, the lack of information turns into worse and worse capacity to manage every victim's case. Number two, the lack of connectivity among different offices. Since they are not building statistical information, but keeping administrative records, each office has a parcel of information. They share that information only on exceptional basis, mostly due to informal agreements between some public servants. Although a key variable is a very well-known concept for those who manage databases, only a few offices register a key variable, even if the formats require it, because it's not compulsory. Since there are not vetting process for databases and handbooks are limited and mostly ignored, the comparability, exploitability, and exportability of the data is limited too. Indeed, that points out another attribute on information production and use. When we find good practices, those are short-term initiatives, informal, and based on public servants' will and skills. They are rarely institutionalized. Three, the fantasy of centralizing statistics production. Having so many offices producing somehow statistical information, probably the first reaction is to think about how to centralize and standardize the collection process. For example, a national bank that feeds from local offices information, right? Well, evidence shows that it's not the solution, at least not if the design of such an endeavor ignores the particular dynamics of each locality and offices. For instance, the BANAVIM, which is the Banco Nacional de Datos e Información sobre Casos de Violencia contra las Mujeres, tries to standardize data collection at the national level. However, for the local public servants, that initiative turns into double records. Since BANAVIM asks for information in a different way, different variables, different categories, and overcharge them using their limited resources. On the other hand, those who feed the bank don't have access to all the information collected by other agencies. Then they are not able to use it and to benefit from this national register. For public servants, these efforts are mostly extractive and rarely profitable. In addition, due to its design, BANAVIM collects information from catalogs of agencies, letting aside other agencies that can also provide important insights. For example, since BANAVIM does not consider the information coming from the National System of Children and Adolescents Protection, the CIPINA, what we know about girls as violence victims is limited. Even more, they are considered in a database only as daughters of a woman victim of violence. What about those victims of their own mothers? Girls are definitely a blind point in statistical information production, and we will keep working on that. Just to conclude, how to deal with this huge collection of problems? Well, after listening, you have probably some ideas in mind. Investment, specialization, training, not only in statistics, but also in gender perspective, diversifying and analyzing and paying attention on local challenges, wills and dynamics. I conclude saying that despite the sad portrait I just made, there are many possibilities in the short and the medium term to improve information quality and in consequence, public action regarding gender-based violence. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Wow, so many questions keep adding up. And I know that our audience has questions too. Please continue to send those in. And we have the opportunity to listen to Gemma, and after that, we'll move straight to questions. Thank you so much, Gemma. Thank you for being with us today.
Yes, thank you. I mean, these have been wonderful presentations. And so my role here today is to provide some initial comments, reactions. And I would just start by saying that I've been working with my colleague, David Carey, on research trying to compare Mexico and Central American femicide trajectories in Central American region with Mexico, also from a historical perspective. And so listening to this is really thought-provoking. So thank you for those. And the other thing I would say just in general is that, I mean, as we know, this is a common challenge, not only Mexico, Central America, but really in the Latin American region. And we have some evidence in terms of femicides having increased as a result of structural adjustments, the war on drugs, the increase of punitive measures on behalf of the state. But there are many more questions than answers. I mean, there is very little that we know, and in great part is the lack of reliable statistical information, which is something that unites both presentations. Although I would say there is also a lack of more qualitative analysis as well. No, I mean, so both of those complement each other. So let me just first refer to David's paper, which I had the opportunity to read, or at least a draft of what he presented today. And this is very relevant and ambitious in terms of the methodology and the scope, no? Since they use both quantitative and qualitative methods in order to get at the core of these questions in terms of state capacity, no? I mean, and really the paper, what is showing is that at the level of the prosecutorial capacity is not only about budgetary constraints or the budget spending that is available, but rather about the existence of a special prosecutor office for femicides and gender-related crimes, no? So it really shows that it's as in other questions of crime and violence in the Latin American region and in Mexico in particular, is not enough to have a more budget. It depends on which is this budget spent. No, I mean the quality of this spending. So given that that is not only a question of the quantity or the budget, but rather of the function or the capacity of the quality in nature that these offices have, I would be more interested in learning more about the type of training that they get. No, I mean, we know from the experiences of the creation of comisarias de la mujer, no, or these special police officers that exist in countries like Brazil, like Nicaragua, that gender training is quite crucial. So I wonder if there is like a gender training, gender-based training that you could tell us more about. No, I mean, that it makes the difference in the creation of these special offices. And then also, what do they do? No, I mean, in terms of the how do they change the investigation, and what is the importance that their job does in terms of bringing more visibility to this type of crimes? Now, another question that I had is, as you very well showed, the map is not homogeneous, right? I mean, there are like places where these offices have been created. Do you see any commonalities in terms of the context in which there is a greater presence of these special prosecutors units? Does it have to do with, I mean, in your presentation, I think in the paper too, you kind of suggest that it might be the increase in levels of femicide or the increase in levels of violence that push for the creation of these offices. But I'm wondering if there are other related questions, no? I mean, such as perhaps the visibility that these crimes have. I mean, the work being done by civil society organizations, or even if you see some correlation in terms of the importance of international cooperation, no? Or U.S.-Mexico security cooperation. Does this have an impact too in the creation of these offices? And I wonder too, like in relation to this, what is important, because I know, David, that you have worked on this too. how would you say that the findings of this research help us or could help us reorient U.S.-Mexico security cooperation in order to tackle more directly the challenges of femicide, no, and the importance of femicide in the security crisis that Mexico is undergoing. And in terms of the work being done and that Teresa Martinez presented, no, that I found really fascinating too. I mean, I think it gets also at the question of the importance of statistical information, no? Like she mentioned, has to be reliable, has to be comparable, but it's very difficult to get at this. And I guess what question that came to my mind is what numbers do we collect, right? I mean, because most surely femicide is at the tip of the iceberg, right? I mean, every case of femicide is the last stop in a long-term trajectory or personal trajectory of a woman that has suffered several forms of abuse, no? I mean, so when that statistic of femicide doesn't tell us the whole story, no? And I believe that in order to have a more proactive policy design and intervention, we should be thinking about statistics that take into account all these previous stages, no? I mean, that have to do with domestic forms of abuse, with sexual violence. So how do we do a better job at understanding and measuring these other forms of gender-based violence that have an impact on femicides? And also, how would numbers or statistics help us understand better the connections between these different forms of violence, no? I mean, domestic violence and their femicides. And the other kind of like, it's more like an open question, because by listening to you and listening to the importance of statistical analysis, it also came to my mind that, of course, we need also to understand more. We have so many questions to answer, no, in terms of, and perhaps qualitative analysis needs to be brought in terms of how do femicides relate with the war on drugs, or how do they intersect with the war on drugs, also with state-led violence, no, and again, with increasing militarization of security in Mexico. I mean, we have some initial or some suggestions in terms of how do they relate, but we don't know enough. And then also the relation with domestic violence, no? I mean, with these different spheres. And then finally, I mean, a kind of provocative question, or again, like I understand the importance of statistical information, but I only worry that the same way that we fell in Mexico into what people call like the numerología, no, with homicides, no? I mean, how many homicides do we have? Like, how have homicide rates changed? How do we, like prevent the risk of falling into this numerología when it comes to femicides, right? I mean, because the number is important, but as long as we don't understand the qualitative nature of this crime, and again, how it intersects with other forms of violence, I think our responses and our policy responses are going to be limited. No? I mean, so that's just not to deny, again, the importance of numbers, but how do we approach the production of these statistics in order to prevent us from falling short of understanding the complexity of the phenomenon? So again, these are just some initial comments. I mean, for really wonderful research that you two are developing with your respective teams. And I'm really looking forward to learning more and also hear what others have to ask or comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gemma. Andrew, I don't know if you wanted to jump in and comment with us right now.
Sure, Alejandra, thank you. Thank you all. I apologize for interrupting what is a fantastic conversation. I just wanted to share an unfortunate scheduling development due to a combination of scheduling factors and COVID. We're not going to be able to have our middle panel, the panel with initially the governor, the congressman, and the senator. So the good news is I think this panel can go a bit longer. There's a lot clearly to cover. And to our audience, we apologize. There's likely to be a bit of a gap between panels. We're trying to see if the panelists for the final panel can get here a little bit earlier, but I just wanted to jump in, explain that to all of you. We apologize for any inconvenience, and those of you looking forward to that middle panel. But now we'll go back to you, Alejandra, and if you can go a little bit longer, I know you all have commitments as well, that would be great. So thanks for that.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And the questions are pouring in. Gemma, you posed so many questions. Before I start adding questions to the mix, I think if Teresa, David, if you can take 5 minutes each to just address some of these issues that Gemma has put on the table, that would be wonderful. So who would like to start?
I went first last time, so I think it's Marita.
Teresa, bienvenida.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Gemma, for all your questions. Of course, are the kind of questions that we keep asking ourselves all the time, and of course they are provocative. That's why this is just the start of a bigger project that we have in mind, a whole agenda on gender-based violence. I would like to address this question on what numbers do we collect and why it doesn't tell us the whole story. Why, if we see this figure on femicides, we don't really have the story? And I'd say that something that we learn in this project is the problem of the connection of the information, is that we have these parcels of information coming from different offices, but no one is putting like all the dots together. So it's quite difficult to really trace every single case and to know what happened with that woman, not only in order to pay better attention of this case, but also to prevent other cases in the same pattern. So most of the times what we have is information here and there, and no one is putting together the dots. So the possibility to analyze this pattern and to, for instance, figure what kind of variables increase the risk of a woman that has been a victim of several kinds of violence to be murdered, it's kind of rare. However, we found some specific good practices. For instance, in Chihuahua, they have an index trying to calculate the risk of a woman to be murdered, considering the variables they are collecting. So probably we can criticize or trying to, evaluate if this index is well done, if we can do it better. But at the end, what they are having now is the possibility to analyze, not only to use the information to justify their budget or to say we are working here because we are serving victims, but what they are trying to do is to serve them better, right? So now they are trying to implement this kind of analysis longer and in a bigger scale. And of course, we have this other idea of the qualitative information. While they are producing the statistical information, they are also kind of letting aside a lot of other information because they don't know how to do with that kind of information, with qualitative information. For instance, in an emergency call, they can take a lot of notes. They have a format. They put, in the boxes, they check the boxes, but they also have this open space to describe a situation. So they can go further and further, and it depends on the one who is taking notes, who is writing down this information. Once we have this information written by hand, no one is able to capture this information or to analyze this information. So we have very, very important qualitative information there in different formats that could be used to understand much better, again, these scenarios in which a woman is victim of domestic violence and eventually is going to finish in the top of the iceberg, right? In this mortal expression of violence, which is femicide. At the same time, we have, for instance, some practices, individual practices. A medical doctor, for instance, shared with us that since he has worked before in another office and he learned a lot about violence against women, so he created this kind of traffic light with the partners, considering this case, once I receive a woman with this specific schema of of violence, I assume that this is not a rare case. This is something systematic. So he triggers somehow the intervention of the psychologist or the social worker. But this is something that he just made with his team. But once this guy is not anymore in that office, or is not the same nurse or the same social server who is working with him, this mechanism is not working. So I think that the last question is about to avoid this numerología, that you are completely right. We're kind of obsessed with numbers. It's true, never forget that this information has to help us not to say if it's rising or decreasing, but to better understand the problem, the whole problem and how to prevent it. So we have to use not only the information that we show at the end, at the top of the iceberg, but the whole information, because if we track the information, we are also able to show what has been doing every office of the state doing. Are we doing it well? In what part of the process do we lose women and we condemn women to be murdered, for instance? And that's all for me.
Thank you so much, Tere. David?
Yeah, thank you so much. Just in going through Gemma's questions, talking about the type of training that prosecutors receive. I mean, one of the things that I think is clear is that we need to see better criminal investigations generally in Mexico. This is a common theme because of the very high rates of criminal impunity in Mexico, and the real challenges that prosecutors face in terms of resources, preparation and training. And it's true that investigating femicides does require a knowledge of the law, right? Because different federal law and state laws establish specific criteria for what qualifies as a femicide. And in fact, requires that in certain states that any homicide initially go through a checklist to identify whether certain criteria exist. And so, but it's part of the reason, I would say it's certainly possible and necessary to do more training on femicides for all homicide investigators. But when you have a person or a unit that is specifically dedicated to doing one thing, and it develops the specialized expertise and the knowledge and the experience to properly handle those cases, you get better results. That's what our study shows. And I think that's true, not just for femicides, right? That's true for any type of crime. And so there's a real argument for thinking about structuring prosecutorial agencies in Mexico in a way that properly channels resources, that develops and cultivates knowledge in those units and capacity in those units. And I think that's something we're still trying to work on at the federal level with the Fiscalia, which dismantled initially some of the specialized units that had previously existed in the PGR. But I think, specialization has its benefits. And that's kind of one of the main points of our study. And frankly, I haven't seen a lot of research, even in the US, on how special prosecutors' offices are, what effect prosecutorial capacity has. So this is, to me, an interesting area of research, and it's been enlightening for me to see the effect of this as we've looked at it. But I do think that in the U.S., skipping Gemma's question about U.S.-Mexico cooperation, I think we have a real opportunity to assist Mexico in improving prosecutorial capacity generally, but especially in the creation of these kind of specialized prosecutorial offices for gender crimes. We don't have femicide as a specific category of crime in the United States, but we do have certain special categories like hate crimes, where we have to look for those circumstantial elements to a crime to really understand what's going on and properly investigate and prosecute those cases. So I think that we have important insights that we can offer. I would love to see the bicentennial framework develop an emphasis or develop programs that would assist with prosecutorial capacity generally, but also in a specialized way with certain kinds of crimes, including femicide. Emma asked, I think, a really important question about why some states have been more enlightened or more inclined to create these kind of offices. And here I think the role of civil society has been very important, right? There are certain states like Chihuahua where they have a special prosecutor's office where they have done a lot of work because people have pushed hard for decades to properly investigate this issue. I also think, going to the question about the intersection of femicides and the war on drugs, it is, while we go to pains to point out that having a special prosecutor still makes a difference regardless of the level of homicide, it is certainly true that higher rates of that femicide as a crime is found more frequently, and female homicides are found more frequently in states where there are higher levels of violence. And so you see, if in a high violence state like Guanajuato, where they have a special prosecutor, you do see more violence against women in those states, partly because there's more violence. And so that begs the question of why do we see more violence in certain states? And that's very much tied to the problem of the ongoing battle in the war on drugs, the ongoing conflicts between criminal organizations and between criminal organizations and the government. And so definitely, I think there are linkages there. Lastly, on this question of falling into numerología, I mean, when I started doing work on Mexico, the problem wasn't numerología. The problem was an absence of data, right? 20 years ago, when the Justice Mexico program started, we couldn't get homicide data from the previous year or two. We couldn't get it at a micro level. Now I get, every month, I get very detailed data, very good data from Mexico's National Public Security Agency. And I think that's been hugely beneficial to our understanding of these problems. So I don't think numbers are the problem. I think it's the numbers that we choose to look at and how we use those numbers that really matters. And so when people were, over the last year or two, when people were saying, oh no, the number of femicide investigations is going up, I was saying, well, isn't that a good thing? Isn't it good that these terrible crimes are being properly investigated, right? Because it shows that we're taking those crimes seriously. So the Mexican government was being criticized for not doing enough to keep femicide numbers down. No, Mexican government should actually be trying to increase its capacity to identify and prosecute those crimes. We don't want to inflate those numbers. We have to look carefully at those numbers and make sure we're actually tracking what we want to track and so on. But I think right now there's so much that we don't know or that we'd like to know, that there's still a need to focus on improving the data, as I said before, but also pushing to get the data that we need. As I said, I'd love to see numbers on how much is every state spending on investigating femicides. Like we need to know that. How are these tax dollars being used? We do need more qualitative information. I haven't seen a lot of people looking at how the data vary for female homicides versus male homicides, as I pointed out today. Those are the kinds of data that we can use to point out the qualitative differences. And then, of course, the grassroots level work that Teresa is doing and Mexico Evalúa is doing is critical to really understanding all of these issues. We couldn't have done a lot of we couldn't have found a lot of things that we found without actually talking directly to prosecutors and getting their insights. There are so many light bulb moments that we had in our study because we didn't just look at the numbers, right? And so I appreciate that comment. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, David. And I'll pick up right where you left off with this data dilemma. And I would venture to say that anyone that has done research almost in any field in Mexico has faced some sort of challenge with data availability. I think we've had a really hard time just in terms of accountability and getting quality data across state, municipal, and federal governments, and being able to work with that data and compare it over time. But this is different. And I think, Teresa, you and Mexico Evalúa have said it very loud and clear. The lack of information in this realm is not random. It's part of this larger structural violence that women and girls face in Mexico, and that keeps contributing to this violence. And by brushing so much data under the carpet and not connecting the dots, we're missing out not just on what is being done well, but what is being done terribly and needs to be addressed immediately. So just a couple of questions that stem from there. First, obviously, the data availability determines in a great measure how we fully understand the crisis and injects a sense of urgency into this crisis that this needs right now on an international scale. It also, and all three of you have said, prevents us from adequately accompanying the victims and their cases. But I wanted to ask you two questions. The first one is, have you found notable differences or good practices in this data collection across the municipalities that you've studied? And is there enough information that you've talked about not being able to connect the dots the way we wish we could, but do you have or have identified best practices in how certain policies across local and federal level, policies that are actively trying to successfully de-escalating the violence? And let me explain this. If a girl faces violence, goes to the state, asks for help is given or not, this may escalate, and then she asks for help again. And as you have all described, this can end tragically in a femicide. But how can we identify when something is being done right and women do and girls do receive the help that they need, and we're able to not see that tip of the iceberg? I just first wanted to, I know you mentioned Chihuahua in this index, but beyond that, what other good practices have you started documenting?
Thank you, Alex. Yes, Chihuahua is certainly a good example. I think it's the explanation behind is what David already mentioned. It's about they have been struggling with this problem since the 1990s, but also with the pressure, the international pressure, a lot of NGOs pushing to not only to prosecute this crime, but also to trying to deal with all these kinds of violence. So what we can see in Chihuahua is different levels of even engagement and part of these offices they have in order to better understand the problem. You can find in Chihuahua, for instance, some offices that are even raising some discussions, some very, very interesting discussions on concepts we are using to, for instance, create that variable. Do we have to call them victims? Are we creating like a kind of an stigma for women each time that we call them victim? What kind of term do we have to use for the aggressors? Are we trying to give the whole story, the complexity of the violence against women using these variables or these other variables? So they have a path that much more developed than other municipalities that has a huge problem on violence, but that probably are not being on the spotlight for a while, like Chihuahua. And what we learn is that if we ignore the lessons that we can learn from the local perspective, and for those who are working with, in fact, with the victims, and not only with the data, but also with them, then we are not, we don't really learn the lesson, and then we can condemn this kind of good practices to like something rare that is just having one specific office. They have also worked, and some of them not only in Chihuahua, but also, for instance, in Chilpancingo, they are trying to work with these working groups. They are working groups working already, like these mesas de trabajo, right? So they are really trying to put together some of their ideas and to try to share information. The thing is that most of the times these working groups are not well known, for instance, or again, they are participating in like a not very uniform way. So here I think that the main call is to institutionalize these good practices. That's hope every time that you go to these offices and you know that someone is trying hard to do it well, right? Like this medical doctor or social worker who is really trying to protect women and to say, if next time, if we are not doing our job good, next time she's gonna right here like even worse, or she's gonna die, right? So the thing is that we can see these kind of practices here and there. Probably the main problem is that they are not able to institutionalize this kind of practices. And I'd say like that the last thing is that sometimes when we give some suggestions to address this kind of problems, sometimes we also forget them as the main users of these kind of suggestions. So we go with these great things like you have to be more sophisticated with your software and something and this and that. And their problems, their daily trouble is not there. Their daily trouble is how I manage these kind of things. No, like sometimes we are discussing within the team, who is taking care of the mental health of these people who are dealing with this kind of trouble, right? So we don't really
How
know
many cases do they have to resolve per day?
per day, like if
365
they
days
were
a
like,
year.
like a machine of any other product, right? So if we pay much more attention on them as they are acting, I think we learn not only good practices, but also we remake our suggestions thinking, okay, what is not only useful for you, but what really helps you to do your job, considering that every time that one of these public servants miss the opportunity to register and to keep going in a good quality register, we are raising the possibility that that woman is going to be eventually murdered. So here we have like another scenario. It's not only I can't understand this problem because I don't have enough information. Here we are talking about
the stakes are very high.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And that brings me, we have 10 minutes to go. Lots of questions, so I'll throw them out there, and Gemma, David, please answer whatever you want. But we've talked about this number of investigations, and David, you've brought up this issue, this dilemma with how the number goes up, and our first instinct would be to say this is terrible, the number of femicides is going up, but really we talk so much in Mexico about the cifra negra, and in many cases we want these cases to be discussed. We want to see more investigations being opened, and at the same time, nothing's going to change if simply we see an investigation being opened that is going to end in absolute impunity, like many of the cases that you mentioned, in many cases that we all know. And so one of the questions we've received is, are we seeing a direct link between more investigations being opened and a reduction in the violence faced by women and girls across the country? So I'll leave that question there. I'm also receiving questions about what the US can do. And if Gemma, David, Tere, if you were the decision makers with a budget and could assign the resources, the support to change something in Mexico, how would you go about building this institutional capacity that you guys have all described? And one last thing, because this is also something that we see not just with femicide, but with other crimes in Mexico, is this immediate, sometimes political response to a crisis. And so a governor will be faced with a terrible crisis and will announce a new special prosecutorial office, but then no real true institutional capacity is built. Or if it is, it's there for the short term. And once a new administration comes in, we see real challenges in keeping that work and those teams functioning with the budget and the priority and the political will that they need to continue on their work. So if you guys could address that in 2 minutes, that would be wonderful. Thank you. We're going to need more panels for this.
Should I go first?
Sure.
I'll jump in. I appreciate the question about do more investigations, the data that we're finding correlate in some way to lower levels of violence against women. I would say right now we don't have the data to show that. And you know, it's possible that in places where these special prosecutorial units have gone up, that we will start to see, you know, an effect, because as you put people behind bars for committing these kinds of crimes, it sends a message, it reduces recidivism and so on. But frankly, like we don't have those data yet, and that will require, I think, a lot more time and resources to answer that question. What I would also point out, it's much easier to get data on criminal investigations. Those data are published monthly, than it is to get data on prosecutions. For that, we're currently looking at the recently published, or somewhat recently published, survey of the Mexican criminal justice system that has a bunch of data on prosecutions, trying to tease through those data. We're working on it, but it's a painstaking process, and it's not as easy to be able to come to decisive conclusions about what's happening to these criminal investigations. And it's another illustration of where we need really to push, and we've encouraged INEGI to help us tease out those data and make them more accessible. As for what the United States can do on this specific issue, if I were designing the bicentennial framework and we're sitting in the rooms, I mean, first of all, it's a negotiated process, right? Because the Mexican government has very specific things that it wants to do. And so one thing I would do, I mean, if I were on the Mexican side, I would really be pushing the Mexican federal government to take this issue seriously and to make it part of the bicentennial agreement. And that's where Mexico Evalúa and other NGOs in Mexico can really put some pressure and say, this needs to be part of the bicentennial framework. We're not just talking about homicides. Yes, we care about that, but we really want funding and support to do the kind of work that we're doing on femicides. And then secondly, I think you need a specific RFP on two specific RFPs. One is to support the evidence-based research that can inform policy. That's self-interested, right? But I think that, you know, you've got to have people who are looking at the numbers, pushing to get better numbers, so you know what you're doing. But secondly, you do need a specific RFP, request for proposals on training and equipping special prosecutors' offices to tackle these kinds of crimes. And that's a multi-million-dollar, you know, effort to go across different states, especially those states that have lagged, the ones that don't show up on our map. Those are the places where we need to be pushing, I think. And so providing assistance, technical assistance to prosecutors' offices and even to legislatures, right? Because some of this stuff has to be codified in order for the special prosecutors' offices to take effect. The last thing I would do is, if I were the Mexican government, one of the things that we learned from special prosecutors is if they happen to live in a state where the prosecutor's office is independent and has frictions with the governor, it's harder for them to solicit federal resources because those resources have to be approved by the governor. So if I were the Mexican federal government, I would create a special fund that can be directly solicited by independent prosecutorial agencies to support those agencies, which are sometimes investigating or prodding their own state governments. Otherwise, they have to go through the governor's office. They're not going to get the resources, and they can't be as effective. That's it.
Thank you, David. I don't know how much the governors will like to hear that.
I don't work for the government.
You're right. Gemma.
Sure. No, I mean, David already mentioned a very good, important point. So I would just say, like, in terms of what the United States can do, I think this is a central question because for too long, U.S.-Mexico security cooperation has focused on security threats that are considered the really relevant ones. No, I mean, so either drug-related violence or violence associated with criminal gangs. Femicide has not been at the core of U.S.-Mexico security cooperation. Neither has been gender-based violence, and I absolutely think that there is enough evidence from PAHO, I mean, also from the work developed by several scholars in Mexico and in other Latin American countries, that gender-based violence has a very serious intergenerational impact. No, I mean, we have evidence that, you know, women that are exposed or children that are exposed to gender-based violence, I mean, and of course, femicide, again, is the most dramatic expression of it, have a higher risk of experiencing themselves violence in their adult life. No, so if we take seriously this question, no, I mean that gender-based violence is at the base of many other forms of violence. No, that it has a great intergenerational impact, but that it's also again transmittable in terms of different social spheres. No, that it doesn't exist only in the domestic sphere. Then we should include this as a central part, really at the basis of any U.S.-Mexico security cooperation initiative that we have. Now, I think that some of the things that were said here today, including what David said in terms of how femicide numbers correlate with homicide trends more generally, also give us enough evidence in terms of like femicide doesn't exist in a vacuum, of course, and it's not only related to some sort of, you know, like private issue, no, that has to do with like domestic matters, no, or even worse so with crimes of passion, no, which is kind of like the sensationalistic narratives that sometimes accompany these forms of crime, but they exist in connection and in relation to, again, the security crisis that Mexico is going through right now. No, I mean, so I would say, you know, putting this as a priority in terms of U.S.-Mexico security cooperation, focusing on questions of state capacity that, again, as has been discussed here, doesn't only relate to budgetary constraints or adding more budget, but in terms of the how is that budget distributed, with what kinds of like gender-based training are they associated. And the last thing I would say is that we don't need to, you know, invent the El Hilo Negro, no? I mean, like, I think there's enough also evidence and good experiences, and that civil society organizations, especially you know, women's organizations, feminist organizations, have a lot of know-how in terms of how do you build, how do you create a secure and trustworthy environment so that women and girls feel more confident to talk about these crimes, I mean, and to approach authorities where they are feeling in a vulnerable position. No? I mean, so clearly Absolutely. Picking up those lessons and also working very closely with grassroots organizations, especially women organizations, I would say.
Thank you so much, Gemma. And we definitely have some incredible organizations and female warriors that risk their lives on a literally daily basis to speak out on these issues. So thank you so much, Tere. We have about 1 minute to go, but don't want to end this without a last thought from you.
Yes, thank you, Alex. Well, I'll just say that, of course, we have a lot of things to do, but in this cooperation relationship, prevention has been a very important issue. So we phrase all the time, we frame all the idea of cooperation, like we are able to prevent a lot of crimes and part of this violence. Once we have this better information, it's gonna, I think it's gonna be a good inspiration, a good trigger for this cooperation. And I think the investment has a good root now, because it's not like just giving money to increase the quality of the information. Now we know, at least in some municipalities that are the mirror of others, we know that we have challenges on the vetting process. Then we have there something to work with. Or in other cases, what we have is something more related with the capacity to analyze information. Then we can really focus this kind of contributions in order to really reinforce the agency's capacity And of course, in the training, not only to better understand the statistical production, but also with this gender approach to the data that is I think it's gonna change the way we understand the problem, and at the end, the way we deal with the problem, because now we have been talking just about those who have been knocking the door of the state. So we have some information in a very messy way, but we have information. But we didn't talk today about those who are not in these databases because they are not in the state eye somehow. So we have a lot of work to do, but we are trying to do it.
Thank you so much. And these effective interventions, pinpointing exactly what the needs are at the local level, are crucial in talking about cooperation. Tere, I also want to give you an opportunity to just mention where we can continue to follow the work that Mexico Evalúa is doing. I know you'll be very active specifically on this topic throughout March. Is it the Mexico Evalúa website?
Yeah, it's gonna be there. Tomorrow we have a presentation with the UN Spotlight Initiative allies, and then we have the whole month we're gonna be presenting part of this project, and also other part of the different work that we have been doing in this matter. So all the month we are gonna start tomorrow, well, today with you, and then we are going to keep presenting things till the beginning of March.
Wonderful. David, Gemma, Teresa, thank you so much for your work, for your research, for speaking out about this issue. I really appreciate it. We will continue to follow what you do and what you say closely. And thank you again for participating today. And I'll hand this back over to Andrew. Andrew, thank you so much.
Thanks, Alejandra. Let me echo, thank you all so much. Really a really fantastic, informative discussion. Thank you all for the hard work you're doing on this important issue. We'd be delighted to continue to work with all of you. So the call that we should have more conversations like this did not go unheard. For those of you who perhaps were joining to see a 3 o'clock panel or waiting for a 4 o'clock, let me just explain, due to, as I mentioned, some scheduling challenges and COVID challenges and other obligations, we've unfortunately had to cancel the panel that should have started at 3 p.m. So what we'll do is begin the panel on AMLO's strategy, security strategy, precisely at 3:30. So we'll start that early. We'll have about a 10-minute break. Your screens will go blank. You'll see a standby message, but please do stand by and do join us at 3:30 for our next panel. Again, thank you to this panel for the great work, and thank you to the audience for your understanding about the circumstances that we were unable to control. Thanks, everybody. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the continuation of our 10th annual U.S.-Mexico Security Conference. I want to thank everybody for their patience and understanding as we adjust our schedule a bit on the fly this afternoon. We will find another time to invite Governor Garcia, Senator Navarro, and Congressman Cuellar to join us to share views on important security issues. 2 logistical notes before we resume the program. We do have translation available, for this panel. Translation is available by clicking on the globe icon on your screen. We'll also take questions from those of you in the audience a bit later. You can provide questions to us either by tagging us on Twitter at Mexico Institute or emailing them to mexico@wilsoncenter.org. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our final panel, Assessing AMLO's Security Strategy. Claire Silke is a specialist in Latin American affairs at the Congressional Research Service. She has over 20 years of experience in research and analysis on U.S.-Latin American relations, security issues in Latin America, U.S. foreign assistance, and political developments in Mexico and Central America. She has published numerous reports to address congressional queries on topics such as gangs in Central America and the Merida Initiative. She has testified before Congress on U.S.-Mexican security cooperation and collaborates with government officials, academic experts, embassies in the United States and across the region. She has taught courses on U.S.-Mexican relations in both Mexico and the U.S. for students, academics, and foreign service officers. Silke holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Spanish from the University of Notre Dame and a Master's of Public Affairs, Latin American Studies and Public Policy from the University of Texas at Austin. Clara, thank you so much for joining and for being able to join us a bit earlier than expected. And I'm happy to hand the panel over to you.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I'm really excited today to discuss a book that I've been reading this weekend feverishly in Spanish, trying to make sure I capture as much of the nuance as I can, by Ricardo Marquez Blas. He's an independent consultant in security, crime prevention, and information systems. He has more than 28 years of experience in design, development, implementation, and evaluation of public security, crime prevention, and information system strategies and policies, having held numerous strategic positions in several federal law enforcement institutions. He previously served as the head of public security in the information unit of the Mexican National Security Commission for 4 years, where he was the head of Plataforma Mexico, an ecosystem of databases and tools and information systems for public security and crime prevention. He also previously held roles in the Mexican Executive Secretariat of the National Public Security System, and he is a PhD candidate at the School of Political and Social Sciences at UNAM. And he's going to be presenting his book after I introduce our illustrious commentator. Vanda Feldbad-Brown is a senior fellow in the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. She's the director of the Initiative on Non-State Armed Actors. She is also the co-director of the Africa Security Initiative and the Brookings series on opioids, the opioid crisis in America, domestic and international dimensions. So much that I could say. Vanda is an expert on international and internal conflicts and non-traditional security threats, including insurgency, organized crime, urban violence, and illicit economies. Her field work and research have covered, among the others, Afghanistan, South Asia, Burma, Indonesia, the Andes, Mexico, Morocco, and a lot of countries in Africa. She just got back from spending 2 months in Mexico, so I'm really excited to hear her comments on this book. And now I'm going to mute myself so that we can get to the real stars of the show. Thank you. Sigue, Ricardo.
Muchas gracias, Claire. Muchas gracias. Le agradezco al Instituto México del Woodrow Wilson Center. Agradezco la participación de la doctora Vanda y de Claire en esta mesa de análisis. Es un gran honor participar con ustedes analizando este tema tan importante para quienes están interesados en la problemática y en los temas de México. No sé si la presentación pueda cargarse. Claro, muchas gracias. Decía, es para mí un motivo de mucho agradecimiento para el Instituto México que haya acompañado la edición y próxima difusión de este libro que trata de los temas y problemas de seguridad en México. Si podemos avanzar a la primera lámina, por favor. Quisiera empezar con el arranque de la actual administración, del actual gobierno, cómo iniciaron su perspectiva que tenían al inicio de esta administración, de cómo estaba la situación de seguridad. Claramente y con razón tenían una perspectiva bastante crítica de la situación de seguridad que prevalecía en México, porque a finales de 2018 ya estaba claro que México estaba atravesando por los niveles más altos de violencia homicida que se registraban en la historia contemporánea del país. También a los pocos meses de estar en funciones la actual administración, hicieron el compromiso de que en 3 años se tendrían niveles razonables de paz y tranquilidad. Claro que hubo otras aseveraciones, otras afirmaciones respecto de la mejoría casi inmediata del tema de seguridad, pero digamos, para tratar de enmarcar el periodo de gobierno en el que ha transcurrido actualmente, que son 3 años. A los 3 años, la meta que se había fijado la actual administración es que habría niveles razonables de paz y de tranquilidad. Y la meta que se fijó para finales de sexenio es que el 50% de la violencia letal, que la violencia letal se reduciría al 50% junto con otros delitos como los secuestros, el robo de vehículos, robo a casa habitación, el asalto en las calles, el transporte público, que son de los delitos que más se cometen en México y que más afectan a la ciudadanía. ¿Podemos pasar a la siguiente lámina, por favor? Bueno, ¿y cómo estamos? ¿Cómo estamos después de 3 años? Claramente, después de 3 años de haber iniciado la actual administración, estamos lejos de las metas que se habían fijado. Tres distintas fuentes oficiales nos dan la misma perspectiva. ¿Cuál es esta perspectiva? Que estamos estancados en los niveles más altos de violencia letal que se han registrado en el país. No solamente en términos generales, sino particularmente en el tema de los femicidios. Tenemos niveles récords de violencia en contra de las mujeres y también en otros temas como la violación y la violencia intrafamiliar, donde el principal segmento que sufre este tipo de violencia son las mujeres. Y no es solamente la violencia letal. Cuando vemos los delitos denunciados, también se encuentran en niveles récord, aquí claramente por encima del nivel que se registraron en 2018. Los delitos denunciados por segunda ocasión han rebasado el umbral de los 2 millones de delitos denunciados. La primera ocasión en la que esto sucedió fue en el 2019 y ahora en el 2021, ya con los últimos datos, tenemos que también se rebasó este umbral de los 2 millones de delitos. Es decir, no solamente la violencia letal, sino también la incidencia delictiva está en niveles muy altos en el país. Adelante, por favor. Ahora, aparentemente, bueno, no aparentemente, estamos en los mismos niveles y aparentemente digamos que sería igual, pero no, la violencia letal es comparativamente, si bien cuantitativamente es la misma, está en los mismos niveles, cualitativamente se ha agravado y se ha vuelto mucho más compleja, básicamente por 4 cosas. Primero, la creciente participación de la criminalidad organizada en la violencia letal. En el 2018 se estimaba que 45.8 de todos los homicidios que se cometían en el país estaban vinculados a actividades del crimen organizado. Un recuento periodístico estimaba que para 2020 el 77% de todos los homicidios que se cometen en el país estaban vinculados a actividades del crimen organizado, y la propia autoridad federal, el propio gobierno federal ha comentado que el 75% de todos los homicidios que se cometen en el país está vinculado a actividades del crimen organizado. Sí, el crimen organizado es con mucho, claramente, el principal motor de la violencia letal que existe en el país. Otro tema que lo hace más complejo, cualitativamente más complejo y más grave, es la ampliación y consolidación de las áreas controladas por el crimen organizado. Esto, las zonas geográficas que están dominadas, controladas y francamente gobernadas por el crimen organizado, donde la vida se regula, la vida económica, la vida general, digamos, los mercados criminales son regulados por las propias organizaciones del crimen. Cada vez se ha ido incrementando progresivamente en los últimos años. Y hay otro tema que es particularmente importante y particularmente preocupante, que es la cada vez mayor presencia del crimen organizado en el ámbito político electoral. No es que esto sea una novedad en el caso de México, pero sí lo que es nuevo es las modalidades o la forma tan franca y tan abierta en cómo esto se presentó en el proceso electoral pasado, en el proceso electoral federal, que también fue el proceso electoral más violento que se había tenido. Entonces, una cosa que es muy importante es tener claridad que para el proceso de consolidación de la democracia que está en curso en el país, uno de los principales, si no es que el principal problema para este proceso de consolidación son la actuación y la cada vez mayor presencia de los cárteles de narcotráfico en el ámbito político electoral. A esto habría que sumar, desde luego, el crecimiento muy importante de la Corporación Federal encargada de seguridad, que es la Guardia Nacional, que tiene prácticamente 3 veces el tamaño de la anterior Policía Federal. Los niveles récord de participación de las Fuerzas Armadas en temas de seguridad, la cantidad de elementos del Ejército y de la Marina no tienen precedentes en la historia contemporánea del país. Y desde luego hay que sumar un conjunto de reformas jurídicas que se supone hacían y les dotaban de mayores capacidades para prevenir, integrar, investigar y castigar el tema de la criminalidad, como el incremento en el catálogo de delitos que requieren de prisión preventiva oficiosa. Adelante, por favor. Una vez que estamos, digamos, esta es la situación en la que estamos. Ahora, ¿qué puede pasar hacia adelante? Bueno, claramente la meta de reducir al 50% la violencia letal en el país no se va a cumplir. De acuerdo a algunas estimaciones, nosotros hicimos tres escenarios, el moderado, el optimista y el ambicioso, con base en las capacidades que en periodos anteriores de reducción de la violencia ha mostrado el país, independientemente de cuáles sean las razones y cuáles hayan sido los instrumentos y las capacidades. Digamos, la mayor capacidad en un periodo largo o relativamente largo, en un ciclo de reducción de la violencia es del 2.7, es lo 2.7% anual. Y con esta, llevado al doble y después al triple, armamos estos distintos escenarios. Entonces, claramente, el objetivo de reducir al 50% la violencia no se va a cumplir. En el más ambicioso, que es también en el menos probable de los casos, llegaremos a una tasa del 20.8, de la tasa de 29, llegaremos al 20.8, pero en el escenario más realista, o digamos en todo caso el que sería más probable alcanzar, que es el escenario moderado, tendríamos una reducción hacia el 26.1, es decir, pasaríamos del 29.1 al 26.1, solamente 3 puntos en la tasa de homicidios por cada 100.000 habitantes. Después se hace un ejercicio que es interesante de cuándo regresaremos al año 2007. El año 2007 fue el año, o ha sido el año, en el que se ha presentado la menor tasa por cada 100.000 habitantes de homicidios en el país en los últimos 90 años. Claramente, en estos 13 años ha habido un incremento muy importante, pero si nos preguntamos ¿cuándo podríamos regresar a la situación de 2007? En el mejor de los casos, en el más ambicioso y también el menos probable de los casos, sería hasta el 2035. Incluso el caso menos, el escenario moderado, tiene grandes problemas para poderse concretar, porque requeriría de un esfuerzo presupuestal, de un esfuerzo de diseño, de implementación de políticas públicas eficientes que no tenemos. En ese mejor caso, regresaríamos más o menos por ahí del 2067. Ahora, como todos los mexicanos queremos y aspiramos a una sociedad con altos niveles de tranquilidad, si aspiráramos o si nos pusiéramos como meta llegar a una sociedad pacificada, que está considerada como, son aquellas consideradas como con 2 o menos homicidios por cada 100.000 habitantes, bueno, la verdad es que nos tomaría muy largo tiempo. En el más probable de los casos, que es el más moderado, digamos, el escenario moderado, nos tomaría prácticamente un siglo, llegaríamos más o menos por ahí en el 2017, en el más ambicioso llegaríamos en el 2052. Es decir, ninguna de las actuales generaciones prácticamente en términos reales podrá desarrollar sus actividades cotidianas, sus actividades normales con los niveles de seguridad o de letalidad que actualmente, si se toma un avión, se pueden, digamos, disfrutar o se pueden tener en algunos otros países como Holanda, Dinamarca, Noruega, Japón y Alemania. Adelante, por favor. Estos son, digamos, los escenarios año por año que ya les había mencionado. En el mejor de los casos, y eso será una cosa por ver, tendríamos una tasa del 26.1, es el más realista, tenemos una versión muy realista. Si es que una cosa importante que se me pasó mencionar al inicio, cuando veíamos las cifras actuales de homicidios en el país, es que en los últimos 5 meses ha habido una reducción observable, notable, en los niveles de violencia letal en el país. Todavía en el primer semestre del 2021, las cifras de homicidios iban arriba de lo que se había registrado en el año anterior, en el 2020. Pero a partir de septiembre se ha registrado una notable reducción en la violencia letal. De tal manera que con los datos que conocemos en enero, de este mes, el mes de enero será formalmente el mes en el que se hayan registrado la menor cantidad de homicidios desde que inició la actual administración. Todavía hay que esperar las cifras del INEGI, que son datos mucho más robustos, porque el año pasado estaba este mismo panorama. Con las cifras del Secretariado Ejecutivo se tenía una visión de que se habían reducido los homicidios, pero cuando en octubre del año pasado el INEGI dio a conocer sus resultados, en realidad hubo un pequeño incremento. Entonces, desafortunadamente, para ver qué tan robusta son estas cifras, tendremos que esperar a el dato del INEGI, que desafortunadamente lo tendremos a finales de octubre o principios de noviembre para saber si efectivamente se convalida esta tendencia. Pero bueno, lo importante que yo quisiera llamar la atención es que en estos 5 meses sí hay una tendencia, hay 5 meses con una notable reducción hacia la violencia letal, cuando menos en lo que reportan las procuradurías estatales de justicia de las entidades federativas. La siguiente, por favor. Y esto es el escenario para regresar a la menor tasa histórica, que es el de 8.1 lograda en el 2007. Realmente nos tomará muchos, pero muchos años el escenario de la violencia letal con las tendencias actuales. Tomará mucho tiempo, mucho esfuerzo y muchos recursos. Adelante, por favor. Y el tema de cuándo podría México llegar a los niveles de una sociedad pacificada son realmente desalentadores, no solamente para quienes, digamos, tenemos mayoría de edad en México, sino también para el desarrollo de las actividades de las generaciones jóvenes y de las generaciones futuras. El panorama futuro en materia de seguridad y de violencia letal en el país no es muy alentador, no es muy halagador. Adelante, por favor. Este es un tema muy interesante, el caso de Tijuana, porque en México, precisamente por la difícil situación que está en materia de seguridad, ha estado y sigue estando a debate la estrategia de captura, de descabezamiento, de captura de capos, de descabezamiento de las organizaciones del narcotráfico. Y lo que hay que tener, digamos, presente que efectivamente México tiene experiencias muy malas en la detención de líderes de cárteles de narcotráfico, porque hay ocasiones en las que se ha generado más violencia y se incrementan los niveles de homicidios en el país. Pero también hay otros casos en el país en el que eso ha sido distinto, ha sido diferente. El caso de Tijuana en el 2006, con la detención de el líder del cartel de Tijuana, ilustra que no se detuvo a este líder y a 2 lugartenientes, y con los datos de carpetas de investigación por homicidios dolosos se puede ver que no hubo un incremento de la violencia letal. Claro, la desventaja es que tampoco hubo un decremento de la violencia letal, ni se afectaron de manera estructural, de manera constante, en el largo plazo, las capacidades del cártel de Tijuana en este caso. Pero, cuando menos, no hubo un incremento en la violencia letal y había un jefe, un líder y 2 lugartenientes en la cárcel. Más adelante, en uno de los picos observables, que es en enero, a finales de 2009 y enero de 2010, se ve claramente que se produjo una baja importante, casi inmediata, en la violencia letal, luego que se detuvo a un líder de una organización criminal que estaba disputando el control de la plaza a una de las, con el cartel de Sinaloa, perdón, con el cartel de Tijuana. Entonces, aquí esto muestra que en ciertos casos, bajo ciertas condiciones, la detención de líderes del narcotráfico sí puede generar no solamente bajas importantes, casi inmediatas en el corto plazo, sino también tendencias de mediano plazo en la reducción de la violencia. Y aquí, hasta aquí dejaría mi intervención y les agradezco mucho su atención.
Okay, Vanda, would you like to make some commentary on the book?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to engage once again with the Mexico Center at the Woodrow Wilson Center, one of the leading areas of research on Mexico. And it's a great pleasure, Claire, always to have a discussion with you, and also an honor and very much a joy to be having this conversation with Mr. Ricardo Marquez Blas today about his book. First of all, very hearty congratulations on the book that I'm delighted to recommend to everyone. It's very data rich, and as you have just seen from the presentation, data rich with great nuance and thoughtful analysis that is certainly very much needed to move Mexico toward better public security policies and toward better public security. As Claire mentioned in the introduction, I was fortunate to be in Mexico in the fall after a year of COVID depriving me of enjoying the many great things the country has to offer, and was able to once again do research in various parts of the country. And overall, what I saw was a very pessimistic picture in terms of security, and one that tallies a great deal with what Mr. Marquez Blas was talking about. Let me make sort of few comments, few highlights that echo some of his findings and perhaps bring my perspective on them. I mean, starting with the issues of the totality of violence and perhaps the decreases that we have seen in 2021 and in January of 2022. I would posit that overwhelmingly the changes in violence that we are seeing are still really just white noise in the operational tempo of the criminal groups. Already the operational tempo of attacks on each other, on other criminal groups, splinter factions, internal purges, and against the government and population is enormously high by the standards of criminal groups around the world, and even by the standards of insurgencies. It's very hard to sustain this level of operational tempo, and yet Mexican criminal groups that in many ways function like militias, like insurgency, have been doing so for a long time. More distressing, in my view, is the fact that to the extent that we are seeing decreases in violence, they are almost never the result of better government policies, whether at the result of the federal level or whether at the result of the state or municipal level. There are some exceptions every so often, but more often than not, the overwhelming trends tend to be that when violence goes down, it goes down because a particular criminal group, whether one of the large two, Sinaloa Cartel or Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, or smaller groups, were able to achieve sufficient territorial and deterrence control for a particular amount of time. And that's very much also the story of Tijuana, and for that matter, Ciudad Juarez, of Acapulco, and even Monterrey. That to the extent that peace, or at least decreases in violence, emerge, they are essentially narco peace. They are at the discretion and capacity of the criminal group. And if that discretion and capacity changes, either because there is a more expansionist, aggressive leadership that comes to power, or because the criminal group is no longer capable of deterring and fending off its rivals, we see violence going up. This is not a new phenomenon. It's not a new phenomenon of the López Obrador administration. It's a trend or consistency rather that we have been seeing, frankly, since the Calderón administration through the Peña Nieto administration. And it continues also because the López Obrador administration has been extremely reluctant to confront criminal groups with any kind of lethal force, particularly any kind of visible lethal force that would generate pushback from either the criminal groups themselves, with what happened in Culiacán in the effort to arrest Los Chapitos, one of the current leaders, some of the current leaders of the Sinaloa cartel, or what's happening when self-defense groups, often fronting as militias, as self-defense groups, when they are in fact other local criminal groups, or even just mobs of people have decided to murder someone because they accuse them of being a thief, a criminal, a car thief, or if poachers of illegal wildlife, Totoaba poachers protest and violently attack government property and government personnel, the overwhelming directive of the López Obrador's administration is not to use lethal force. And we have seen it even in very dramatic circumstances, such as when the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación has repeatedly resorted to using drones and dirty bombs attached to the drones to bomb populations to take over areas of Michoacán, parts of Tierra Caliente in Michoacán. So to the extent that decreases in violence take place, they are overwhelmingly instances of narco peace, often very flimsy, very unstable, complicated also by the continuing bipolar war between the Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación playing out, and the local contestations playing out underneath that macro war, with very many local conflicts, complicated local conflicts taking place underneath that umbrella of the confrontation that goes way beyond Mexico and spans all the way down to Colombia, Chile, Peru, and in fact, non-violently, but intensely also into Asia, Pacific, and Mexico. And this coincides with the overwhelming approach of the López Obrador administration of not using lethal force, not using lethal force visibly, and trying to rely on, in my view, very ill-defined and poorly thought through socioeconomic programs to combat crime, which are pervaded by corruption, at least the instances that I was able to see when I was in Mexico in October and November. I would also like to reiterate the point that Ricardo made about the expansion of criminal groups into many domains of people's life, including very systematic control, very systematic effort to control economic activity. There are some well-known areas in Tierra Caliente, in Michoacán, it's the avocado and lime industries, but we are increasingly seeing it in very many domains. In particular, there is a systematic effort by the Sinaloa cartel and to a lesser extent, Jalisco Nueva Generación, to take over fisheries in Mexico, both legal and illegal. I have a report coming out in March that details that in great detail and associated articles. But yet it's a part and parcel of just systematic, comprehensive effort, not just to illegally tax and extort, but more broadly control economic activities and economic life. And there are differences in how the two big cartels handle that. The Sinaloa cartel often tries to control the entire vertical chain from production all the way up to the point of exports, and many associated economies. In the fisheries, it's not just extorting and controlling the fishers, but also processing plants, restaurants demanding they can only buy fish brought in by the criminal groups and cannot buy other fish, and many other domains. Jalisco Nueva Generación, though overwhelmingly resorting to violence and very brazen violence as a method of intimidation, tends to simply franchise and demand taxes, and is in some ways years behind the Sinaloa cartel, both in building political capital with local populations and politicians, but also in how it deals with the economic domains and economic spheres of control. The brazenness of the violence is another important issue that amplifies the message of Mr. Marques's Blas book about the extent of violence and its intensity. And I want to spend a few seconds on talking about brazenness of violence. There are, again, differences. Jalisco Nueva Generación, far more brazen in what kind of violence it engages than Sinaloa cartel, much more buttoned down criminals and extortionists, still very, very violent and very aggressive. But the brazenness matters. It's all part and parcel of intimidating society, intimidating politicians, and intimidating security government actors, whether they are part of Guardia Nacional or they are part of SEMAR, SEDENA, let alone municipal police forces. Ricardo spoke about the issue of electoral violence, and again, something that I want to amplify. As he mentioned, the role of criminal groups and assassinations are not new in Mexico. They have been part of political life and political death in Mexico for a very long time. But the extent arguably has become really dramatic. I would also suggest that the modality has changed, again, in very worrisome ways. You know, we sort of look at 10 years ago, many criminal groups were simply happy to intimidate whoever was elected a government official at the local level or perhaps state level after they were elected. What has changed now is not just the amount of funding they bring to electoral campaigns, but their own effort to select candidates to prevent others from running, so that the interference, once again, is not just after candidates are elected and extorting and intimidating them, but really trying to structure who can run, who cannot run, who will be eliminated. And I guess the final point that I want to make, so that I allow us to have enough time for questions and discussion with Claire and with the audience, is to look at some of the issues with security policy. So I already spoke about the reluctance really to deploy lethal force, particularly visible lethal force, by the federal government. What that has translated into is sending often the National Guard with very ill-defined objectives simply to stand on the street. A security official in one of the very violent states told me that the role of the Guardia Nacional is to stand on the street, and that standing there alone will generate confidence among the population that they feel protected. I would posit that mainly, at most, disperses criminals to a few blocks away from the tracks of the Joint Patrol or the Guardia Nacional, but fundamentally doesn't change anything unless we see systematic takedowns of networks, of criminal networks, at least the middle operational level of criminal networks. That requires investigative capacity, and that continues to be a problem, as both SEDENA, SEMAR, still some of the principal actors, and Guardia Nacional can often act only when they see a crime in flagrante and cannot investigate beyond. And there is state police issues when they can act. Is it common crime? Is it organized crime? At what point can they investigate? A lot of bureaucratic stovepiping and difficulties there. And President López Obrador dismantling of the federal police had many effects, one of which was a radical decrease of investigative capacity in Mexico. Even prior to the dismantling, homicide levels were still effectively prosecuted at only about 2%. And since the dismantling of the federal police, the decrease in investigative capacity has been dramatic. Perhaps 3/4, 70–75% of investigative capacity is gone. On top of the issue of not being able to investigate beyond in flagrante for the vast majority of law enforcement services. And finally, when Ricardo opened his presentation, he very effectively outlined what was the vision of the López Obrador administration when he assumed office, how his administration was going to go about achieving peace and much better public safety in Mexico. One of the issues that López Obrador centered his efforts early in his administration was beefing up municipal police. Long police forces that are deeply overwhelmed, that have been deeply overwhelmed, and that the Calderon administration, the Peña Nieto administration all struggled to put any kind of heft into improving and achieving and mounting any kind of effective municipal police reform. Well, at the beginning of his administration, President López Obrador wanted to focus on that and made, in fact, the municipal police the centerpiece of how security will be provided to the public. Yet 3 years later, the budgets for the municipal police, which overwhelmingly are dependent on transfers from the federal government, and budgets even of state police, which equally are funded from the federal government to a large extent, have been decimated. The federal government has simply slashed those budgets by a radical amount. And so the very entities that President López Obrador identified early on as the core providers of security are the very entities that his administration has defunded, despite the fact that they already prior to that defunding were deeply struggling and challenged. So as we are heading into the next 3 years of his administration, we are looking, in my view, at a very dire picture where security policy continues to be flailing and failing, and where criminal groups in Mexico are attempting to influence greater and greater aspects of a person's lives, not just greater and greater amount of territory.
Thank you, Vanda. Thank you both so much. I have a couple questions myself, and then I'd love to turn it over to the audience. We already have a couple coming in. I was wondering, Ricardo, since you worked on Plataforma Mexico at one time and you've been in different administrations, like what has carried through in terms of using data to plan the efforts against organized crime? Is there still the system that shares information, or is that all kind of thrown out the window from one president to another?
Sí, por fortuna lo que se construyó de Plataforma México, que tampoco partió de cero, porque ya existían bases de datos, Plataforma México las integró en una sola plataforma que pudiera ser consultada. Las bases de datos de Plataforma México, no existe, digamos, información pública de cuál es la situación que existe en cuanto a la cantidad y a la calidad de la información. Pero presumiblemente lo que puede esperarse es que la cantidad de información que alimentan las entidades federativas, los municipios a Plataforma México, y la calidad de la información que alimentan haya bajado de manera considerable. No solamente por lo que ya mencionaba la doctora Vanda, de la reducción de los recursos federales para apoyar a las policías municipales, sino también por el gran desencuentro que hay sobre qué hacer en materia de seguridad. Claramente, al inicio de la administración hubo un intento por capturar, digamos, las capacidades policiales, por la federación de hacerse de todas las capacidades policiales que existen en el país. Obviamente, cualquiera que conociera un poco de los antecedentes históricos de estos intentos sabía que eso no iba a funcionar, pero además de que no funcionó, esto produjo mucha reticencia. Fue como una advertencia para los gobiernos estatales y de los municipales de lo que venía, porque después de este intento de capturar las capacidades policiales, hubo intentos por capturar las capacidades del sistema de salud, capturar las capacidades del sistema educativo, por capturar las capacidades a favor de la federación de muchas capacidades que cuentan las autoridades estatales y las municipales. Entonces, independientemente de que seguramente sigue los sistemas de información, la infraestructura informática, muy probablemente la calidad de la información y la consulta de la información ha decaído bastante. Y es muy preocupante porque es un insumo importante para las capacidades de investigación y de prevención del delito con que cuenta el Estado mexicano.
And then maybe Ricardo first, and Vanda, if you have any thoughts. Many countries, the pandemic, led to less crime, or at least some types of crime. I know even in Mexico, like less robberies if people are at home or whatever. But the homicides stayed really high. Are you surprised by that at all, or what do you think can be learned by the fact that homicides have stayed so elevated even during a time when everything was shut down? Is it basically that the cartels keep going no matter what, or I don't know? How would you interpret that trend?
El tema es muy complejo y sorprendente, porque cualquiera hubiera pensado que, digamos, el confinamiento iba a afectar a todos por igual, pero no afectó los niveles de violencia. Lo que mencionaba de la reducción en los homicidios hace todavía más interesante y menos comprensible cómo ahora que en estos últimos meses que hemos salido del confinamiento, que cada vez hay menos personas en confinamiento, lo que sucede es que los homicidios bajan. Es algo, digamos, sorprendente. Todavía no hay suficiente información para ver, pero mi sospecha es que claramente el tema apunta a lo que ya mencionaba Vanda, hay suficientes elementos para pensar que la variable a la que puede atribuirse, la menor variable o a la que puede atribuirse esta baja en la violencia letal en México es el mejor desempeño de los programas oficiales y el mejor desempeño de las policías que existen en el país. En todo caso, sería la menos probable de las causas que pudieran explicar el tema de la violencia letal, pero claramente se está comportando de una manera que no conocíamos, de una manera bastante imprevista, el tema de la violencia letal en México.
But perhaps I can add just a few thoughts here. One is to sort of point all of us to the realization that although in various parts of the world, in early 2020, criminal activity did experience decreases, particularly street crime. Things tended to change later on in the year, in the later part of 2020, and certainly in 2021, as criminal groups adjusted in various ways, whether that was very significantly increasing online cybercrime, or whether it was developing new methods of street crime. So in various parts of the world, we in fact saw swings up in criminal activity later on into the COVID era. What we didn't see anywhere was any long-term disruptions in drug trafficking. And for example, in East Asia, we see enormous amounts of flows of synthetic drugs despite COVID. The difference that was there well before COVID, namely that the East Asian markets tend to be very peaceful with homicides in 1, 2 per 100,000 in comparison to the Latin American markets, drug markets, which tend to be very violent in the tens per hundreds of thousands has changed. That was not really altered. But drug trafficking went through various changes in methods and volumes being shipped, all kinds of modalities, but no significant decrease. And in fact, in many parts of the world, including in Mexico, criminal groups took advantage of COVID to strengthen their hold on populations, to develop greater territorial control and to build even tighter control over many dimensions of people's lives, as well as efforts to build political capital by providing socioeconomic handouts, by hiring people who were fired, chemists, for example, who lost jobs as a result of COVID, or other people who found themselves unemployed and could provide surprising level of technical capacity for organized crime groups in Mexico. We have seen the group systematically making an effort to hire them. And I would also like to add just one comment to your prior question about data and Ricardo's very important thought that we are seeing the losses of data in Mexico. I would say that applies in many areas. For example, regarding illegal logging, illegal wildlife trafficking, the effect of the López Obrador administration shrinking budgets of very many government agencies, law enforcement ones, but also regulatory agency across all domains of regulation. And many people from those agencies leaving them has resulted really in very sporadic and minimal government presence and very sporadic and minimal government oversight and even access to data.
Mm-hmm. And my one final question before I open up to the audience is, it looked like you were talking about in Tijuana that in that case study, at least, high-level arrests were able to be made without necessarily causing a huge jump in violence. And I know Vanda's always said not to focus on the capos alone, but the entire network. Do you think that you have any recommendations for the last 3 years of the López Obrador administration, based on the fact that you saw in Tijuana an interesting example of arrests or detentions not necessarily leading to high-level violence? Or do you think that was just a one-time occurrence?
Yo creo que es un mecanismo útil, pero cuyos resultados finales dependen de muchas variables y de el tiempo que se le invierta a realizar esta actividad, la calidad y la cantidad de información de inteligencia y del esfuerzo policial que se le dedique. Es decir, sí puede ser un instrumento útil, pero depende mucho, digamos, del tipo de organización. No es lo mismo que hubieran detenido, como pasó en el 2006, al líder del cartel de los Arellano Félix, que en el 2010 hayan detenido al líder de una organización con poco tiempo de haberse constituido, que dependía mucho del apoyo del cartel de Sinaloa, aunque conocía bien el terreno de Tijuana, porque el líder era de ahí, y que no tenía tanta membresía y no tenía tantos contactos internacionales ni nacionales para hacerse de recursos y para poder comercializar o poder llegar hacia el mercado norteamericano. Entonces depende de muchos factores, pero claramente en México, no solo Tijuana es solamente uno de los casos de esos, pero claramente en México es uno de los instrumentos que es indispensable. En las actuales circunstancias hay un incentivo muy perverso porque los líderes de las organizaciones del narcotráfico saben que no están dentro de los objetivos estratégicos ni tácticos de las instituciones de seguridad y de procuración de justicia. Eso genera un incentivo muy perverso en el que prácticamente todo se puede sacrificar. Se pueden sacrificar lugartenientes si es que no son, digamos, de la estructura familiar, si no es un cartel con una estructura familiar, como en el caso de Sinaloa. Pero todos los mandos medios o los soldados pueden ser sacrificables siempre y cuando la cúpula dirigente del cartel, dependiendo del tipo de cartel que se trate, puede salvarse las operaciones si es que la cúpula no cae. Ahora, una parte muy importante en la que Banda ha hecho en algunas otras oportunidades llamado la atención es en la detención de mandos medios. Esa es una parte muy importante, muy estratégica, particularmente en la circunstancia que atraviesa México, porque estos mandos medios son los que tienen la experiencia táctica operativa, son los que tienen el mando directo sobre la tropa. Entonces, detener y desarticular esta parte de los mandos medios es indispensable, es indispensable. Claro, es en mi opinión, más importante detener a los líderes con tiempo suficiente, porque no es importante. Uno de los errores que se cometió en la etapa de Enrique Peña fue que se iban deteniendo a los líderes, pero se iban dejando a los otros colíderes o se iban dejando a los lugartenientes. Y entonces lo que sucedía era una sucesión bastante rápida y bastante, digamos, sin problema, bastante lógica, ¿no? Pero cuando se tiene el tiempo con Tijuana para poder detener a los líderes, a los lugartenientes y a los mandos medios, los resultados son bastante efectivos incluso en el mediano plazo.
Okay, thank you so much. There's one audience question I wanted to get to because. Okay. Just before so we have enough time, someone from the audience asked what the two of you think would happen if there's another Morena president And so you have like 9 more years of similar policies. Thank you.
Anda, si quieres comentar algo.
Ricardo, please go ahead, I'll follow.
Yo creo que esta política, particularmente de abrazos, no balazos, y la política de no llevar a cabo acciones específicas en contra de los carteles y sus líderes, no continuará, incluso si en el 2024 es electo un presidente del mismo partido que está actualmente. Quizá habrá alguna modificación. Yo creo que habrá una modificación importante, pero que es insostenible en el corto y en el mediano plazo. En el corto plazo claramente no va a cambiar, pero en un nuevo gobierno creo que la perspectiva, independientemente de que sea del mismo partido, la perspectiva tiene que cambiar. El nuevo gobierno se verá obligado por la situación difícil de violencia a introducir modificaciones significativas al modelo que prevalece actualmente.
And I would add here that, of course, Morena won in the midterms in some of the very violent areas, or in states where new violence is being introduced by organized crime groups on new economies. And so I would imagine that voters, both ordinary people living with drone bombs, as well as the business community, will be demanding that their lives are not subjected to be under the control of criminal groups. And so Morena is not going to be simply experiencing the responsibility for public security policy at the federal level, but will, in my view, in 3 years be held accountable for what happens at the state level and municipal level. I would also say that many people in Mexico are very exhausted by the violence and the approaches of the Calderon administration and Enrique Peña Nieto administration. And so they have given the López Obrador administration a great leeway to see what they can produce. But if we continue to see the same trends, not just very high levels of violence, but ever greater intrusiveness of the criminal groups into people's everyday lives, into every aspect of the economy, into every aspect of political life, then people hopefully will not just become apathetic and resigned, but will be asking for a right to live free of the oppression of the criminal groups.
Thank you so much. Is there, I guess I just have one last question, unless there's an audience. I was wondering if the United States were to ask one thing of the AMLO administration, because it seems like in this bilateral framework, we're starting with arms trafficking, which is a huge problem, but it's Mexico's priority more than maybe arguably than the United States. What if you were the United States administration, what are the 1 or 2 issues you would ask the López Obrador administration to collaborate on?
Bueno, claramente creo que la prioridad número 1 estaría en el tema de migración, y en el tema de seguridad el principal tema sería el tema del fentanilo y de los opioides, antes que el tema de la cocaína o de la heroína, por la gran cantidad de muertes que se están generando por la sobredosis en Estados Unidos. Que sería una petición muy compleja porque implica a los 2 principales actores del narcotráfico y en las organizaciones principales que tienen presencia en todo el país en México, como es el cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación y el cartel de Sinaloa. Es decir, sería aparentemente pues, muy simple, muy clara, pero implica una gran complejidad y un esfuerzo para México, que además está fuera de su política, la política de seguridad que sí sigue actualmente.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. 100,000 people died in the United States last year. We see record levels year after year after year. And those are driven by overdose related to synthetic drugs, particularly fentanyl. The synthetic drug revolution is sweeping the world. It's made its way into Mexico, where fentanyl is increasingly being spread as a very dangerous use of, as a very dangerous substance of recreational use, often without users knowing it. So countering fentanyl smuggling is fundamental, and it requires being willing to take on criminal groups, the Sinaloa Cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. That needs to be done clearly with sensitivity and focus, not to be augmenting violence levels in Mexico. In my view, there is a way to go about it, to both confront the groups and be mindful that violence in Mexico needs to go down. Unfortunately, I don't think that's what the López Obrador administration is, despite the bicentennial network, bicentennial framework. What I heard in Mexico was very much a vision of the Mexican government wanting its priorities taken care of and having the United States focus on issues in the US while it does what it wants with respect to countering violence or not in Mexico and countering trafficking in Mexico or not. And that, in my view, is not sustainable policy and one that the United States cannot be satisfied with.
Okay, thank you all so much. I really recommend people get a copy of Ricardo's book when it's ready, and it's really, really fascinating, and that you stay tuned for Vanda's articles that will be coming out, as she said, in March, and it's in a series of articles. There's one recent one in Mexico today, in the English publication about security cooperation looking kind of bleak for the year. So not the most uplifting reading, but it's very important for everyone, particularly where I work. And so I just wanted to thank the two of you all and everyone for attending today, and just see if anyone else. Andrew, do you want to take it over? Thank you.
Sure, Claire. Thank you, Ricardo. Muchas gracias, Vanda. Thank you for being here. I just wanted to, Claire, great job moderating. Thank you. As was alluded to, Ricardo's book will be, when it's finished, we will have it available on our website. That should be very soon. And I just want to thank everybody for participating in this panel and the prior panels today and last week. Everything will be available on our webpage. So if there's anything you missed or wanted to check out again, you'll be able to do it there. Again, thanks everybody. Wish you a good afternoon, and we'll see you at our next event. Thanks.
Muchas gracias a todos, Vanda, Claire, Andrew. Muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you also, and hearty congratulations on an excellent book, Ricardo.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.